There are mysteries that puzzle us. And then there are mysteries that completely break our understanding of reality. Imagine a group of 9 elite, highly experienced survivalists venturing into the freezing mountains. They pitch their tent, eat dinner, and go to sleep. But in the dead of night, something absolutely terrifying happens. Something so unimaginable that these hardened hikers take sharp knives, slice their own tent open from the inside, and run out into the pitch black, minus 30-degree blizzard, barefoot. None of them would ever be seen alive again. When their frozen, mutilated bodies were finally discovered, the answers didn't bring closure. Instead, they revealed missing eyes, crushed chests, invisible radiation, and a terrifying Soviet cover-up. This is not a horror movie. This is the chilling true story of the greatest unsolved mystery of the 20th century, the Dyatlov Pass Incident. The story begins in late January 1959 in Sverdlovsk, deep inside the Soviet Union. A group of 10 young, incredibly athletic students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute formed an expedition. Their leader was a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. He was brilliant, fiercely determined, and respected by everyone. He was guiding his team on a 14-day expedition to reach Mount Otertain, located in the harsh, extremely isolated northern Ural Mountains. This wasn't a casual weekend hike. In 1959, this specific route was classified as a Category 3, the most difficult and dangerous level of extreme winter trekking possible. But the team was completely ready. They were experts in harsh weather survival, accustomed to long marches in deep snow. They packed their skis, their thick wool coats, and heavily loaded canvas backpacks. They feared absolutely nothing. The expedition began cheerfully. We know exactly how happy they were because they documented everything. The hikers carried several cameras, taking dozens of black and white photos. They laughed, played guitars on the train, and joked in their shared diaries. On January 27th, they finally arrived at an abandoned logging settlement at the edge of the wilderness. It was the very last outpost of human civilization. But here, fate intervened. One of the group members, Yuri Yudin, was suddenly struck by severe joint pain and dysentery. He could barely walk. With deep disappointment, Yudin hugged his best friends goodbye and turned back to head home, heavily frustrated that he couldn't complete the legendary trek. As Yudin waved to the 9 hikers disappearing into the snowy horizon, he had no idea that getting violently sick had just saved his life. The remaining 9 hikers forged ahead into the unforgiving white void. The landscape they were entering belonged to the indigenous Mansi people who had hunted in these mountains for thousands of years. The specific area the students were trekking toward carried a deeply ominous reputation. In the Mansi language, the nearby peak was named Kholat Shachel. Translated to English, it means Dead Mountain, or the Mountain of the Dead. As January turned to February, the harsh weather rapidly worsened. Dense, blinding blizzards reduced their visibility to mere inches. Temperatures aggressively plummeted down to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The dense, haunting pine forest turned into absolute eerie silence, constantly burying the group under thousands of pounds of fresh, violent snow. They were now completely alone, completely cut off from the entire world. By the afternoon of February 1st, they reached a high mountain pass. Because of the white-out blizzard, they accidentally drifted off course, leading them away from the protective tree line. Realizing their mistake, Igor Dyatlov made a controversial, fateful decision. Instead of marching a mile back down into the safety of the dark forest to escape the freezing wind, he decided to pitch their tent directly on the exposed, open slope of Dead Mountain. Some believe he didn't want to lose the altitude they had just worked so hard to climb. Fighting against horrific, violently howling winds, they dug a hole in the heavy snowbank. They raised their long canvas tent, packed tightly shoulder to shoulder to share body heat, and settled in for the freezing, exhausting night. They were perfectly organized, completely calm. Their final journal entries from that night show absolutely zero signs of panic or danger. They ate a casual dinner of salty bacon and crackers. They even wrote a humorous satirical newspaper they called the Evening Otterton, joking about how difficult it is to study in the mountains. In fact, we know exactly how normal everything was, because someone snapped a final perfectly calm photograph inside the tent right before they went to sleep. The 9 hikers undressed, taking off their heavy winter boots and wet outer jackets, preparing to sleep comfortably in simple, warm socks and long underwear. The pitch-black night aggressively wrapped around the slopes of Dead Mountain. Whatever horrific event was about to happen next, it was totally, violently unexpected. They were about to step into hell. According to the expedition plan, Igor Dyatlov was supposed to send a telegraph back to his university as soon as they safely reached the final outpost. But February 12th came and passed in complete silence. No telegram arrived. At first, no one panicked. Delays in the harsh winter wilderness were absolutely normal. However, by February 20th, the parents of the missing students were sick with intense worry. They fiercely demanded a rescue operation. The Soviet military, university teachers, and indigenous Mansi trackers immediately organized massive search parties. Military helicopters loudly chopped through the freezing gray skies, visually scanning hundreds of square miles of the terrifying, completely empty white Ural Mountains, desperately looking for any tiny sign of life. On February 26th, one of the search parties noticed a strange, tiny dark speck on the extremely steep slopes of Dead Mountain. As they painfully climbed up through the brutal freezing wind, they found the hikers' camp. The green canvas tent was violently collapsed and heavily buried under inches of hard snow. When rescuers eagerly opened the tent, hoping to find the students safely sleeping inside, they found it totally empty. But what completely paralyzed the rescuers in pure terror were the items left behind. The hikers' thick winter coats, heavily insulated boots, food, and money were all perfectly neatly stacked inside. But the canvas side of the tent had been violently slashed open from the inside. They didn't even use the door. They used sharp knives to cut their way out directly into a deadly snowstorm. Why would 9 elite survivalists flee into -30-degree weather without any coats or boots? Rescuers found a deeply chilling clue right outside the tent. The freezing snow had perfectly preserved a trail of footprints leading down the extremely steep mountain toward the pitch-black tree line. Some of the footprints clearly showed socks, others showed a single shoe, and some were entirely completely barefoot. But the most utterly horrifying and deeply baffling detail about the footprints wasn't the lack of shoes. It was the spacing. The footprints showed absolutely zero signs of panic or running. They were walking closely, almost methodically together in an organized group. Whatever terrified them enough to slash the tent made them leave all their life-saving gear, but allowed them to calmly walk away into the darkness. Following the bizarre footprints nearly a mile down into the dark forest, the searchers arrived at the edge of the woods. There, under the incredibly large, twisting branches of an ancient cedar tree, they discovered absolute tragedy. In the snow, they found the miserable freezing ashes of a desperately tiny campfire, and right beside it, laying side by side under the tree, were the bodies of two male hikers, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko. They were frozen absolutely solid, completely stripped down to just their underwear. Looking closely at the giant cedar tree, investigators noticed something horrifying. The thick lower branches were snapped and broken all the way up to 15 feet high. The hands of the two frozen boys were terribly torn and scraped, leaving deeply bloody human skin frozen directly in the pine bark. They had climbed the giant tree in utter desperation. Were they fiercely hiding from something dangerous lurking below? Or were they just desperately trying to see their abandoned tent in the dark? Minutes later, 3 more bodies were uncovered hundreds of yards apart on the brutal slope between the giant cedar tree and the tent. They found Igor Dyatlov grasping violently onto a small frozen birch branch. Further up the slope, they discovered Rustem and, finally, Zenaida. Unlike the first 2 under the tree, these 3 students were entirely facing uphill. They weren't running away anymore. In their absolutely final, terrifyingly tragic moments, heavily freezing to death, they had heroically, desperately tried to crawl back up the mountain toward their tent, aggressively freezing solid directly in their tracks. The bodies were sent down for an urgent official government autopsy. The immediate Soviet medical conclusion seemed brutally simple. All 5 of the recovered students had officially died from extreme freezing hypothermia, but the coroners silently noticed severely bizarre, deeply unsettling details they couldn't aggressively explain. Why were some of the victims' knuckles severely violently smashed and bruised, as if they had heavily fought someone in a desperate hand-to-hand fight? And a very deeply chilling rumor immediately started circulating around the incredibly worried families that young Zenaida's dark hair had violently, shockingly turned pure gray overnight. But the most utterly terrifying fact still remained completely unsolved. 4 hikers were intensely still missing. The brutal winter slowly faded. It wasn't until May, 3 full months later, that the thick snow finally melted enough to explore the deeper, more dangerous areas of the forest. About 250 feet away from the ancient cedar tree, deep inside a steep ravine, searchers noticed something buried under 15 feet of hard snow. Digging down, they uncovered a makeshift snow den. Pine branches were carefully laid out to create a crude, insulated floor. It was a desperate attempt at a survival shelter, but just a few yards away, lying dead at the bottom of a freezing meltwater creek, the searchers finally found the remaining 4 missing hikers. They were buried under thick snow and ice. But unlike the first 5 victims, these 4 hikers hadn't simply frozen to death. The condition of the last 4 bodies was incomprehensible. While the first group mostly froze to death, these 4 suffered catastrophic, fatal physical trauma. Nicholas Thibault Brignol had a violently shattered skull. Alexander Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina had their rib cages entirely crushed inward. But what happened to young Lyudmila was the most terrifying detail of the entire investigation. When the coroner examined her body, he recoiled in horror. She was missing her eyes, she was missing her lips, and her entire tongue was gone. To add to the macabre mystery, these 4 were found wearing clothes that had clearly been stripped from the dead bodies of their frozen friends by the cedar tree. They were actively fighting for survival against something far deadlier than the cold. The lead medical examiner was totally baffled. He officially stated that the immense physical force required to break their bones like that was impossible for a human to achieve. He compared the catastrophic internal damage to a victim of a high-speed, head-on car crash. But here is the bizarre contradiction. Despite their pulverized ribs and shattered skulls, there was absolutely zero external tissue damage. No massive bruises, no cuts, no scratches on their skin. It was as if an immense, invisible pressurized force had simply squeezed the life entirely out of them from the outside. As if this wasn't chilling enough, a standard testing procedure accidentally turned the case from a tragedy into an unbelievable government conspiracy. During the investigation, an inspector ran a standard Geiger counter over the recovered clothing of the last 4 hikers. The needle aggressively spiked into the red. The victims' coats and pants were heavily contaminated with a bizarre, inexplicable amount of radioactive material. Immediately, the Soviet government and the KGB seized absolute control. Relatives were forced into silence. The funerals were highly monitored by undercover agents. The lead investigator was officially removed from the case, ordered by high-ranking officials to completely shut it down. The government slapped a top-secret classification on the files, aggressively sealing them in hidden archives. The official Soviet statement chillingly concluded that the hikers were killed by a, quote, compelling natural force that they were unable to overcome. For decades, the public desperately tried to figure out what that compelling natural force was. The theories exploded. Was it a violent attack by indigenous tribes or escaped Gulag prisoners? There were absolutely no other footprints on the mountain. Did they eat spoiled food and hallucinate? Toxicology reports were completely clean, but a truly bizarre detail was revealed years later. Another group of experienced hikers camping 50 miles south on that exact same night reported a terrifyingly strange phenomenon. They officially testified that they saw massive, glowing orange spheres silently floating high across the pitch-dark night sky, moving directly toward the peaks of Dead Mountain. Because of the highly restricted location and the heavy radiation on their clothes, a huge number of modern historians believe the group accidentally stepped directly into a massive top-secret Soviet military weapons testing zone. Perhaps a classified explosive parachute mine detonated right over their camp. That would explain the violent internal compression completely destroying their lungs and smashing their ribs with absolute zero exterior damage or bruises. Some even deeply believe the highly secretive KGB military thoroughly cleaned up the scene to hide the terrifying explosive truth, leaving the frozen survivors to violently perish in the snow, so there would be no witnesses. In recent years, modern science has presented a far less supernatural theory. Computer simulations suggest that a rare, very specific type of slab avalanche might have crushed the tent while they slept. Hearing the terrifying crack of shifting ice and fearing they were about to be buried alive, they aggressively slashed their way out. The sheer weight of the dense snow blocks could have caused the horrific rib and skull fractures. As for their lack of clothes, extreme hypothermia plays a terrifying trick on the brain called paradoxical undressing. As your body temperature fatally drops, your confused nerves trick your brain into thinking you are actually burning alive, forcing you to wildly tear off your clothes right before you die. Avalanche, secret weapon, or something entirely unknown to science. While the avalanche theory makes logical sense, it fails to completely explain the strange radiation, the glowing orbs in the sky, or the missing eyes and tongue of Lyudmila Dubinina. To this day, despite endless books, movies, and modern investigations, the case officially remains open and entirely unproven. The true fate of Igor Dyatlov and his friends is buried under 6 decades of snow, classified files, and Soviet secrets. In a graveyard in Yekaterinburg, a dark stone monument stands in their honor. The 9 hikers looking out at us, forever frozen in 1959, reminding us that some mountains are better left unexplored. What do you think happened on Dead Mountain? Let me know in the comments.